say, ask a teacher, why do we have art class? What's going on here? I take literacy and math and then art. Why this? I think one great answer is the arts sensitize us to our environment, to ourselves. That's deeply meaningful. Not just, by the way, it's great to say, well, it helps with your creativity. Of course, that's a big part of it. Makes you a better person, teaches you some math. That's all great. But this idea that we're actually made more whole, more full by the arts, I think, for me, is the single most fundamental thing. And when, in about 15 minutes, when this presentation appears to veer very far away from the arts for a few minutes, please keep this in mind. This is why we're veering away, because of this, what I think is a real, for me, a very fundamental thing about the arts. Okay, so before we move any further, there's this thing about, that we hear a lot about how great the arts are because they support other subjects. And I think that's fine. I'm not against us supporting other subjects, bravo. But that is not why we exist. Again, beautiful thing number one is why we exist. We sensitize humans to ourselves and to our environment. The arts make us more whole, more fully human. So this idea that we're here to support other subjects is kind of baffling to me. And so I kind of want to stand against that a little bit. Yes, it's great that evidence shows, and Michael Taut up at CSU has done a lot of research on this. He's a professor of neurology, neurobiology, and also a professor of music. And he's found that, yeah, the arts really help math skills. Bravo, but that's not why we're here. We're here because the arts are fundamentally important. However, your principal may want to talk about this. And so I've got a few slides here to show you how we actually do support other subjects and education in general. There was a study done concluded in 2008 in Florida. There's a follow-up study in Florida that concluded in 2012, and one, I believe, in West Virginia that also concluded in 2012. They all show very similar data. So here's the study. This was all potential seniors for in this case, 2008, were included. So if you dropped out, if you moved ahead, whatever, if you were in that class and graduated on time, you were included in this study. So they looked at all kids in this cohort. So here's the first slide I'd like to look at. This is student GPA. On the right, you'll see there's a color code here. Visual art is on top, blue. Then there's also dance, drama's white, music is kind of orange. On the left side, you can see the GPA, 2.5, kind of screaming up to 3.1, 3.2. And then across the bottom, you can see how many arts courses kids had. I'm hoping you can see okay if you're on that side, but there's also one behind you if you want to spin that way. So this is interesting. Kids who had no arts classes throughout high school, on average, in all four of these areas, scored about, I think it's 2.7. Am I saying that angle right? They scored about a 2.7 GPA throughout their career. And you can see with every additional art course, their GPA went up. So that kids who had 4 or more courses were all the way up at 3.1 GPA, almost a half a point higher. I want to be very clear that this is not necessarily causal, that there's a correlation. So I think there's no doubt that some kids who were more academically minded, or those who had the time, who didn't fail a course, so they had time to take an arts course, were in more classes, so their score went up. So I think there's some of that in there. I think this next slide, though, really kind of lets us know there's more going on than just correlation. There may be some cause. Actually, this is the same with low income. It shows pretty much the same. And then here's the one that I think kind of shows, for me, shows some causality. So this one is SAT verbal scores. On the right again, the legend, art is blue, drama is white. That's an important one to see here, and then music is orange. There's the scores, 460, screaming up to about 560, 562. So the kids who had no arts scored on average around, 518, roughly? Maybe 520? And you can see as they took more and more arts courses, the SAT verbal went up. So the bar for me that really makes it look causal is the white bar. the drama bar. I'm in drama classes quite a bit, and kids they have scripts, they're reading together, they're talking about characters, they're talking about motivation, about meaning. I don't think we should be surprised that those kids' verbal SAT scores would go up. And I think that, although I can't make the case, I believe visual arts and music kids are making the same kind of connection. Actually, I think I will be making the case in the next few minutes that that's true as well, and those scores are actually going up because kids are involved in the arts. Again, if beautiful thing number one is true, that the arts sensitize us to our environment, these are more sensitive, more aware kids, their SAT verbal is going to go up. Okay, so here's, I know I've said it 14 times already, but there it is again. What I think is maybe the most beautiful thing about it, the arts sensitize us to our environment and to ourselves. They make us more whole, more fully human. That's a great thing. That's an amazing thing. All right. Beautiful thing number two. Students who are involved in the arts are much more likely to complete their high school education and to graduate on time. So at the beginning of this, 7 minutes ago, I said, you know, I'm not really so impressed with what we do for other subjects. I am impressed with this. I really think it's valuable that we help kids stay in school and graduate. So for me, I'm going to give up that one and say, well, that's a great thing for everybody. So here's a similar chart from that same study. This is the percent of students who failed to graduate with their cohort. If they didn't have any arts credits, between 25 and 35% of kids dropped out of school if they weren't connected to their school through the arts. And as you can see, there's a huge drop immediately as soon as they begin to take arts classes. And when they take 4 or more, look at that. 5%, fewer than 5% of kids on average drop out. The arts keeps kids in school. It's really valuable. Okay, beautiful thing number 3. We are human because of the arts, literally human. And actually, Clyde and I were talking, I think, Clyde, you began to touch on this concept a little bit, and we were talking in a small group over here. So, Masataka, professor of primate studies at the Japan and Kyoto University, says the following, that humans appeared on the planet, before humans appeared on the planet, there may have been an intermediate stage of human evolutionary history characterized by a communication system which resembled music more closely than language. So we can kind of picture this. I mean, imagine critters before there was any language at all. Early critters made a sound, a grunt, to get away from me, or that's my food, or who knows what, but it was a grunt. And then those became slightly more complex. There were pitches in them to say something more complex. And so over time, by the time you get to primates, which we'll look at now, there's a lot of pitches in primate sounds. For instance, this is a gibbon. And we are cousins of gibbons. We did not evolve from gibbons. We and gibbons evolved from the same critter. We don't know what that was, but we evolved from the same place. And gibbons have long songs they sing. They're 25 notes long. And they also take out like 3 to 5 notes sometimes and sing just those little bits. Like Beethoven, you know, Beethoven, da 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 da, a little bit there, then it gets expanded to a huge melody. They do the same thing. They take little bits out. And it's very musical. Does that sound musical to you? It does to me. I was always afraid when I first discovered this that some people would doubt that could be considered music. So I thought, what present-day artist could we hear to kind of get an idea of how that could be music? And the first person I thought of was Bjork. bit more gibbeting here in a second. Okay, so if you still doubt that Bjork and that gibbon have something in common, I mean, it's even in the same key. And believe it or not, that was the second song, Bjork song I found that just happened to match up. It was uncanny how like, it didn't take a long time to find. So I'm not making the claim that Bjork owes some copyright money to the gibbon, but clearly there's a very strong correlation there. That is music that gibbon's making. Okay, so here's the thrilling part for us. What part has visual arts played in our evolution and our humanity? You guys may know a little bit about Spencer Wells. He's on, this is from TED, a TED Talk.
The DNA tells a story that's very clear. Within the last 200,000 years, we all share an ancestor, a single person, mitochondrial Eve, you might have heard about her, in Africa, an African woman who gave rise to all the mitochondrial diversity in the world today. But what's even more amazing is that if you look at the Y chromosome side, the male side of the story, the Y chromosome Adam only lived around 60,000 years ago. That's only about 2,000 human generations, the blink of an eye in an evolutionary sense. That tells us we were all still living in Africa at that time. This was an African man who gave rise to all the Y chromosome diversity around the world. It's only within the last 60,000 years that we have started to generate this incredible diversity we see around the world. Such an amazing story. We're all effectively part of an extended African family. Now, that seems so recent. Why didn't we start to leave earlier? Why didn't Homo erectus evolve into separate species, or subspecies rather, human races around the world? Why was it that we seem to have come out of Africa so recently? The evidence from genetic data is that the human population around this time, roughly 70,000 years ago, crashed to fewer than 2,000 individuals. We nearly went extinct. We were hanging on by our fingernails. And then something happened. Great illustration of it. Look at some stone tools. The ones on the left are from Africa, from around 1 million years ago. The ones on the right were made by Neanderthals, our distant cousins, not our direct ancestors, living in Europe, and they date from around 50 or 60,000 years ago. Now, the risk of offending any paleoanthropologists or physical anthropologists in the audience, basically, there's not a lot of change between these two stone tool groups. The ones on the left are pretty similar to the ones on the right. We are in a period of long cultural stasis. From 1 million years ago until around 60 to 70,000 years ago, the tool styles don't change that much. The evidence is that the human way of life didn't change that much during that period. But then, 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, somewhere in that region, all hell breaks loose. Art makes its appearance. The stone tools become much more finely crafted. The evidence is that humans began to specialize in particular prey species at particular times of the year. The population size started to expand. Probably, according to what many linguists believe, fully modern language, syntactic language, subject, verb, object that we use to convey complex ideas, like I'm doing now, appeared around that time. We became much more social. The social networks expanded.
So what I'm getting from this, and what he says outright, is fully developed language, visual art, and symbolic thought all appeared essentially at the same time in our evolutionary history, about 60, maybe 70,000 years ago. There was visual art was very much responsible for abstract thought, obviously, and for creating vocabulary and syntax. Now, theater, you've got to believe theater played a big part of that. People were acting out their hunts or their lives somehow for each other. So theater came in. Of course, dance was in probably way before even visual arts on cave paintings. So all of the arts play into this. But visual art, you know, you go on a hunt, you come back and you go into a cave and draw what your experience was to help explain your experience of the day. That becomes more elaborate, and as it becomes more elaborate, those who could do that best, who could communicate best with each other, were more likely to have offspring. And here we are, a very distant offspring. Pretty cool. And also, I think the next slide begins to kind of draw the line. So, It appears that music may have been the first language. Depends on how you define it. For me, I'm pretty comfortable defining it as the first language, as a communication device through sounds using our voice boxes. And then about 60, maybe 70,000 years ago, our creative ability developed rapidly, in part through visual arts. In large part, perhaps, through visual arts, enabling us to survive and flourish on the planet. Again, Wells said that and I never knew this until I saw his talk, that we may have dropped to as few as 2,000 individuals. We may have almost gone extinct ourselves several tens of thousands of years ago. And then through the visual arts, verbal language and symbolic thought worked in a recursive fashion. They worked together with each other to build up actual consciousness. You know, you've got to think about it. If we evolved, at some point our consciousness had to evolve. My sense is, and from what I've been reading from Masataka and Wells and others, it appears that the arts have a lot to do with our consciousness, our being aware of ourselves, and be able to communicate with each other, to remember yesterday and plan for tomorrow. It's pretty cool. So that's how important I think the visual arts are. When I say I'm not sure we need to serve other subjects, this is a big part of why. We are very fundamental. I would make the case, by the way, that physical education and our fitness is fundamental as well. Everything we do is enhanced when we are fit. But without the arts, we would not be fully human today. We absolutely would not be human in the way that we see ourselves today without the arts. I feel pretty strongly about that, based on what I've been reading and people I've been talking with. And life experience. Okay, ready to look at the weird thing about education?
No.
Okay. There's several weird things that we know, but here's one. You know this achievement gap we've been trying to close? Remember that achievement gap? Every day, certainly every year, every decade, we talk about closing that dang achievement gap. And something that I learned recently that I never knew, is kind of interesting, is that the achievement gap has grown by 40% since the 70s. While we're being asked to close the achievement gap, we've not been told this, that all of our incredible efforts have failed, and here they are. These are the things that the national government has put together since the 60s to close the achievement gap. All these different plans, lots of things with fancy names. That's page 1. And if you want to see these, I can always go back and show you separately. But I mean, by the way, Project Follow-Through just came up. In the 1960s, there was a $500 million allocated by the Johnson administration to take the top 20 interventions to raise test scores and close the gap, to find out what the best 1 or 2 plans were, so they could actually close the gap. Every plan, all 20, failed to close the achievement gap. Failed miserably to close the achievement gap. All the best plans failed. Yet here we are, 50 years later, trying to close the achievement gap. By the way, I don't mean to be so depressing. It's not that bad. We're okay. However, nothing we have done in all this time has actually closed the achievement gap, and we're continuing to embarrass teachers, say bad things about schools, humiliate kids in this amazing effort to close an achievement gap that we were completely unsuccessful at closing. And again, it's actually widened in that time. Okay, so the achievement gap appears on the surface. And before I go on, I want to call back, remember this idea about how the arts sensitize us to ourselves and make us more fully human, the importance of the arts, while we look at this bizarre educational attempt. Family income appears to be the key. I will give away the ending and tell you it's not, but everything we're going to look at makes it look like family income is actually the key. So this is kind of interesting. This study was from 07. You look at family income there on the left, and then on the right is a child's average ACT score. With every $6,000 to $8,000 to $10,000 bump in income, their score goes up. Now, by the way, these are averages. There's plenty of kids in poverty who their family make less than $18,000. They score 27, 28, 29 on the ACT. Let's be clear. We're talking about averages here. There's tons of individuals who overcome the achievement gap. Tons. And we can help kids do that. And then there's families where they're making over 100,000, over 200,000, and the kids score a 15 on the ACT. So there's tons of exceptions. But the average is pretty startling, isn't it? It's just absolutely consistent. Every $6,000 to $10,000 it goes up. So how can we make the claim that a low-income school is a failing school and the teachers are bad when it's really about, it appears to be about income? But it's not really. There's a real strong correlation, but it's not actually income. Of course, it can't be. How can just because you make $10,000 more, suddenly your scores are higher? It doesn't make any sense. It's actually about early verbal acquisition. It's about the first 4 years of life. I'm curious, how many of you have heard of the Hart and Risley study from '85, I think it came out? So Hart and Risley did this research to determine why they couldn't close the achievement gap. They've been trying for years. And everybody had, and nobody could do it. And so the Hart and Risley went into homes of welfare people, blue-collar folks, and then college-educated folks with tape recorders, recorded conversation between kids and parents, and found that the average number of words a child hears between birth and 48 months in a welfare family is about 13 million. In a working class family, about 26 million, and in our families, it's about 45 million words. Not different words, but just, reiterations of the same word and tons of different words. They simply hear way more words. Now, it's actually more complicated than that. Subsequent research has shown that it's really about the way we respond to a child who's babbling, and we honor their request for more information. It's things like, oh, look, yeah, this is like if you were to, as a child, a 2-year-old were to babble and point at the mouse, I would say, oh yes, look, Daddy's got the mouse. Do you want to hold the mouse? This is a red mouse. You say 2, 3, 4 sentences that interact with the mouse, and those neurons just start firing, because up till the age of 5, we're growing neurons like crazy. And if we can help the child develop that language during that time, what Hart and Risley found was their IQ scores at the age of 4, which is kind of the ceiling of this. Age 4 is about maybe a little bit into the 5th year. Those scores correlate absolutely directly at 80%, well 79%. 79% correlation between the number of words that kid heard in that kind of interaction and their school test scores, their standardized test scores in the 3rd grade. 80% essentially. I mean, that's astonishing. So the answer isn't really about poverty, it's really about that early communication with kids. Yeah, please.
That's interaction with another human being.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, TV does nothing.
As opposed to videos or TV.
I'm so glad you said that. You're absolutely right. TV, video, computer, whatever it is, does zero good. It has to be an actual human being, and it's because if I'm a toddler and I point at something, I need someone to be able to react to that. In fact, just really quickly, because I'm very short on time, there was a study done where mothers and babies were in a room together and they were told through headphones when to interact with their child and how to respond. And other mothers were given those tapes of what the mother said, so when they responded to their kid, it was not authentic. They said the same amount of words, exactly what the other parents had said, but not at the right times. That was also very ineffective at developing language. Yeah, it's not just the words, it's the human beings interacting in a meaningful way. So this is one thing, this is what's so great about the arts, and I think TAB in particular, to create, we're coming in past that wonderful 4-year window that's so important. By the way, how many of you have a baby, have a child right now who's 4 or younger? Okay. Now, how many of us are frustrated because we learned about this and our kids are 5 or older, right? It's almost everybody. I didn't learn about it in time for my kids. But, fortunately, we are educated and we probably talk to our kids quite a bit anyway. But anyway, especially TAB, which is so much about creativity and interaction and choice, obviously, that there is a real value in that. It's really meaningful, what we do for kids, even though it's past that 4th year. All right. So, I'm sure a lot of you know Kenneth Robinson. He's dynamite. Here he goes. Go tell us why it's important.
We think our view of intelligence. We know 3 things about intelligence. 1, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things. And the third thing about intelligence is it's distinct. I'm doing a new book at the moment called Epiphany, which is based on a series of interviews with people about how they discovered their talent. I'm fascinated about how people got to be there. It's really prompted by a conversation I had with a wonderful woman who most people have never heard of. She's called Gillian Lynn. Have you heard of her? Some have. She's a choreographer and everybody knows her work. She did Cats and Phantom of the Opera. She's wonderful. I used to be on the board of the Royal Ballet in England, as you can see. And, anyway, Gillian and I had lunch one day. I said, how do you get to be a dancer? And she said it was interesting. When she was at school, she was really hopeless. And the school in the 30s wrote to her parents and said, we think Gillian has a learning disorder. You couldn't concentrate, she was fidgeting. I think now they'd say she had ADHD. Wouldn't you? But this was the 1930s and ADHD hadn't been invented, you know, at this point, so it wasn't an available condition, you know, people weren't aware they could have that. Anyway, she went to see this specialist. So this oak panel room, and she was there with her mother, and she was led and sat on this chair at the end, and she sat on her hands for 20 minutes while this man talked to her mother about all the problems Gillian was having at school. And at the end of it, because she was disturbing people, their homework was always late and so on, in the end, the doctor went and sat next to Gillian and said, Gillian, I've listened to all these things that your mother's told me. I need to speak to her privately. So he said, wait here, we'll be back, we won't be very long. And they went and left her. But as they went out of the room, he turned on the radio that was sitting on his desk. And when they got out of the room, he said to her mother, just stand and watch her. And the minute they left the room, she said she was on her feet, moving to the music. And they watched for a few minutes, and he turned to her mother, and he said, you know, Mrs. Lynn, Gillian isn't sick, she's a dancer. Take her to a dance school. I said, what happened? He said, she did. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. We walked in this room, and it was full of people like me. People who couldn't sit still. People who had to move to think. Who had to move to think. They did ballet, they did tap, they did jazz, they did modern, they did contemporary. She was eventually auditioned for the Royal Ballet School. She became a soloist, she had a wonderful career at the Royal Ballet. She eventually graduated from the Royal Ballet School, found her own company, the Gillian Lynn Dance Company, met Andrew Lloyd Webber. She's been responsible for some of the most successful musical theatre productions in history. She's given pleasure to millions, and she's a multi-millionaire. Somebody else might have put her on medication and told her to calm down. Now, I think... What I think it comes to is this. Al Gore spoke the other night about ecology and the revolution that was triggered by Rachel Carson. I believe our only hope for the future is to adopt a new conception of human ecology, one in which we start to reconstitute our conception of the richness of human capacity. Our education system has mined our minds in the way that we strip mine the earth for a particular commodity, and for the future it won't serve us. We have to rethink the fundamental principles on which we're educating our children.
I couldn't say any better, so I kind of left it.
I think we have about 30 seconds if anybody has a comment or question. And then I'm going to hang around. I'd love to talk with you individually and in groups as we have more time later. We do have one comment or question in the front.
It's not really a question, it's just a thought. After watching everything that you presented, at the very end, arts education almost felt jarring. Like it shouldn't be arts education, it should be arts enabling, you know, making it all possible.
Can you hear in the back? She says the term arts education is a little jarring at the end, after you say everything else, and arts enabling is a term you're more comfortable with. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, we should just be allowing it to happen, and that's what TAP does. We provide everything, and we allow it to take place.
The idea that TAB provides this beautiful framework for much more than just art education, but for actually expressing ourselves artistically.
So then we should get rid of the assessment. Baby steps, baby steps.
So there's my email in the top right. I'd love to have you folks write and have a conversation about this. I hope that just maybe this has sparked some thoughts that have been curdling for a while anyway. Did you have a question? Yeah.